On July 6, 2013, an Asiana Airlines Boeing 777 was on its way from Seoul to Incheon International Airport. The plane had 239 people on board, 25 crew members and 214 passengers. The flight got to its final destination safely, but not without incident. The pilots of the plane had been warned about winds here in the area, and they acknowledged that warning. But despite knowing what could happen due to winds here, they flew into it anyway, and this ultimately caused the plane to crash. But there's more to this story than just bad piloting, or a few other factors that led to the crash. Factors that, while not completely avoidable, could have been mitigated if certain things were done differently. One of these factors is something that no one on board could have predicted, which leads me to ask, did fate play a role in this tragedy? Before we get into the details of the crash, let's take a look at the weather that day. On July 2013, San Francisco Bay Area was experiencing some strong winds, especially around the airport. This was problematic because it meant that the planes approaching the runway would have to deal with stronger than usual wind shear. Wind shear can be extremely dangerous for planes. It's when there's a sudden change in the speed and/or direction of the wind. If a plane flies into winds here, it can cause the plane to drop significantly in altitude. Now, depending on how fast the wind hits the plane, how strong it is, and when it hits the plane, the results can vary. For example, if the wind hits the tail of the plane, it can cause the plane to lose altitude. If it hits the wings, it can cause the plane to roll. Strong winds here can be enough to cause the plane to lose all of its altitude and then some. It could cause a plane to stall and then crash. There are two types of wind shear. The first is called wet shear. It's when rain or other forms of precipitation cause wind shear. The second is dry shear, which is when there's a change in wind speed and/or direction, but there's no precipitation. Dry shear is usually caused by one of three things: a nearby thunderstorm, a front, or another area of low pressure. The reason why thunderstorms cause wind shear is because warm air rises very fast. Since hot air holds more water vapor than cold air, when the warm air rises, it takes all of that water vapor with it. The water vapor condenses and forms clouds. As the clouds grow, they become negatively charged. The ground beneath them becomes positively charged. When the charges connect, you get lightning. Thunder is caused by the rapid expansion of air near the lightning bolt. So essentially, thunderstorms create wind shear because air is rising very fast. When a front causes wind shear, it's usually because of the difference in density between the two air masses. Warm air is less dense than cold air. So when a cold front moves in, it pushes the warm air out of the way. That movement creates wind shear. Similarly, when there's a low pressure system, there's air rushing towards that low pressure center. The air has to go somewhere, so it pushes the air around it out of the way. That creates winds here. Pilots are trained to recognize the signs of winds here and know how to respond to them. There are three main signs of winds here: a sudden drop in airspeed, a sudden change in altitude, and a sudden roll. If any of these happen, the pilot should take immediate action to avoid disaster. In the case of Asiana Airlines Flight 214, the pilots were aware of the wind shear in the area before they even took off from Seoul. They were briefed on it by the weather forecasters on the ground. Once they were in the air, they got more warnings about the winds here. The controller told them to expect a 25-knot tailwind component on final approach. What the controller meant was that the plane would experience a 25-knot tailwind during the last part of the approach. The plane was supposed to land on the west coast of the United States. During the approach, the captain was talking to the first officer, and he said something interesting. Said we need to avoid it. What exactly did he mean by that? Well, we may never know since both pilots died in the crash. But most likely he was referring to the winds here. The fact that they were in the air and knew there was winds here in the area meant that they had to be careful. The plane started its descent into San Francisco at 6:57 p.m. The pilots were expecting headwinds along the way, so they set the speed of the plane a little higher than normal. At 6:58 p.m., the plane was at 3,000 feet. The pilots talked to the controller and he gave them some new information. He told them that the tailwind they would be facing was now up to 44 knots. Now that was a lot stronger than what they expected. At 6:59 p.m., the plane was at 2,300 feet. The pilots had forgotten to increase the speed of the plane again. The captain realized this and immediately put the engines into go-around mode. He wanted to get the plane to climb as fast as possible, but it was too late. 7:01 p.m., the plane hit the end of the runway, and it broke up. The plane was now a fireball. It crashed into a hilly area, so most of the wreckage ended up in a canyon. This made rescue efforts difficult. 271 people survived the crash, but 3 died. But this wasn't the only tragedy that happened that day. There were also 2 other planes that crashed trying to land in San Francisco. All 3 crashes were caused by the same thing, wind shear. One of the planes that crashed that day was a Boeing 737-37A. The plane was on its way from Mexico to San Francisco. Just like the Asiana Airlines plane, it was also warned about the wind shear in the area. The captain of the plane decided to go around after seeing a flash of lightning out of the corner of his eye. The plane climbed away safely. The third plane was a Boeing 757-200. The plane was on its way from New York to San Francisco. The plane experienced a microburst, which is basically a really strong wind blast. The plane dropped 4,000 feet in less than 10 minutes. The pilots were able to recover the plane and bring it back to altitude. So what exactly caused these tragedies? Well, the answer is complex. You see, the National Transportation Safety Board believes that the crashes were caused by a combination of factors. First, there was the weather. The storms in the area created the wind shear that brought down the planes. Second, there was the lack of training. Most of the pilots who crashed hadn't been trained to fly in such conditions. Finally, there was technology. Planes didn't have the right equipment to detect wind shear. The NTSB found that in the 6 months before the crash, there were 95 instances of winds shear at SFO. This was the perfect storm. You had a bunch of inexperienced pilots, planes, without the right equipment, and then some extremely strong winds shear. All 3 were a deadly combination. There's one more thing that played a role in the crash of Asiana Airlines Flight 214, human error. The pilots made some mistakes that ultimately cost them their lives and the lives of 2 others. The first mistake was flying into the wind shear in the first place. Could have waited until the wind shear passed, but they didn't. The second mistake was not increasing the speed of the plane. The captain forgot to do it, but the first officer didn't remind him. Finally, the third mistake was failing to use the available resources. The pilots could have asked the controller to turn on the wind shear warning system, but they didn't. So who's to blame for this tragedy? Well, the answer is no one and everyone. The weather was to blame, because it created the wind shear that brought down the plane. The pilots were to blame because they failed to follow procedure, and the NTSB is to blame because they failed to make procedures that accounted for extreme weather events. But there's one more thing that I think played a role in this tragedy: fate. Sometimes things just happen and there's nothing you can do about it. I think that was the case here. The pilots knew there was wind shear in the area. They were warned about it. They knew what could happen, but they couldn't predict when it would happen. They could only go off of the information they had. When they made their decision to fly into the wind shear, it was based on the information they had at the time. The weather was looking okay. There was no lightning or thunder. They had flown through wind shear before and they knew what to do. Maybe they thought they could make it. Maybe they were overconfident. We'll never know. But sometimes when you're faced with an extremely unlikely event, your gut instincts can fail you. In this case, it seems like they did. When the plane started to drop, the pilots tried to do everything they could to save the plane. They went through the proper channels. They followed the right procedures. They did everything they were supposed to do. But fate had other plans for them. What do you think caused the crash of Asiana Airlines Flight 214? Let me know in the comments below. Also make sure to subscribe for more.